in the great effort to create a more just, peaceful, and prosperous world. And from the standpoint of trade and jobs and being fair to companies, we are really, I think, committed. I think they are starting to be committed to a much more fair trade situation for the United States, because it has been treated very, very unfairly. And I don't blame other leaders for that. I blame our past leaders. There was no reason that this should have happened. Last year, they lost 800, we as a nation, over the years, but the latest number is $817 billion on trade. That's ridiculous, and it's unacceptable, and everybody was told that. So I don't blame them. I blame our leaders. In fact, I congratulate the leaders of other countries for so crazily being able to make these trade deals that were so good for their country and so bad for the United States. But those days are over.
Fallout from the G7 summit continues as President Trump again calls out Canada and other key U.S. allies on trade. The president tweeting, "Sorry, we cannot let our friends or enemies take advantage of us on trade anymore. We must put the American worker first." Griff Jenkins is live in Washington. Griff, good morning.
Good morning, Sandra. It appears the president is escalating the start of a trade war with America's closest allies, unleashing a barrage of tweets in the wake of the G7, some aimed at Canada's prime minister, as you mentioned, like this one. He says fair trade is now to be called fool trade if it is not reciprocal. According to a Canada release, they make almost $100 billion in trade with U.S. Guess they were bragging and got caught. Minimum is $17 billion. Tax area from us at 270%. Then Justin acts hurt when called out. This all began when the president shook things up in Quebec, but then became furious when Trudeau held a news conference after his departure and said this.
Would be with regret, but it would be with absolute certainty and firmness that we move forward with retaliatory measures on July 1st, applying equivalent tariffs to the ones that the Americans have unjustly applied to us. Canadians were polite, we're reasonable, but we also will not be pushed around.
That prompting the president to withdraw his agreement to the group's communique and infuriating administration officials, with harsh words coming from the president's trade policy advisor, Peter Navarro.
There's a special place in hell for any foreign leader that engages in bad faith diplomacy with President Donald J. Trump and then tries to stab him in the back on the way out the door.
And Sandra, the fallout continues with G7 leaders like Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel calling the situation, quote, depressing and vowing tariff retaliation as well. Perhaps one positive note, overnight trading was mostly up in the euro, getting a bounce despite heightened worries over this what would be an ensuing global trade war.
Before President Trump traveled to Asia, he faced other world leaders at the Group of Seven Economic Summit in Canada. Allies that are upset over new tariffs he's imposed on steel and aluminum imports. Joining us now, one of the architects of that controversial plan, White House trade advisor Peter Navarro. Mr. Navarro, the summit ended with a nasty dust-up between President Trump and Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau. He held a news conference after the summit in which he said Canada will retaliate for tariffs that the U.S. has imposed on Canadian aluminum and steel. Here is Trudeau.
We move forward with retaliatory measures on July 1st, applying equivalent tariffs to the ones that the Americans have unjustly applied to us. Canadians were polite, we're reasonable, but we also will not be pushed around.
Well, President Trump responded with this tweet while flying here on Air Force One to Singapore. Trudeau of Canada acted as so meek and mild during our G7 meetings, only to give a news conference after I left. Very dishonest and weak. Question, Mr. Navarro, is that really how we want to deal with our second biggest trading partner?
Chris, there's a special place in hell for any foreign leader that engages in bad faith diplomacy with President Donald J. Trump and then tries to stab him in the back on the way out the door. And that's what bad faith Justin Trudeau did with that stunt press conference. That's what weak, dishonest Justin Trudeau did. And that comes right from Air Force One. And I'll tell you this, to my friends in Canada, that was one of the worst political miscalculations of a Canadian leader in modern Canadian history. All Justin Trudeau had to do was take the win. President Trump did the courtesy to Justin Trudeau to travel up to Quebec for that summit. He had other things, bigger things on his plate in Singapore, where you are now, Chris. He did him a favor, and he was even willing to sign that socialist communique. And what did Trudeau do? As soon as the plane took off from Canadian airspace, Trudeau stuck our president in the back. That will not stand. And as far as this retaliation goes, the American press needs to do a much better job of what the Canadians are getting ready to do, because it's nothing short of an attack on our political system, and it's nothing short of Canada trying to raise its high protectionist barriers even higher on things like maple syrup and other goods.
Mr. Navarro, I got a lot to talk to you about, but I do have to press this. You used some very strong words. Stab in the back, special place in hell. You said that came from Air Force One. Are those the views? Are those the words of the president?
Those are my words, but they're the sentiment that was on Air Force One after that. Look, Chris, this was just wrong what Trudeau was doing. The Canadians are totally bungling our trade relationships, and it's due to their leadership. Take NAFTA, for example. We'd have a deal. We'd have a great deal with NAFTA by now if the Canadians would spend more time at the bargaining table and less time lobbying Capitol Hill and our press and state governments here. They are just simply not playing fair, dishonest, weak.
Well, I want to pick up on this, though, Mr. Navarro, because it isn't just Canada. Germany's Chancellor, Angela Merkel, released a photo of the summit, and there was no comment on it, but it certainly looked like it was President Trump against the other members of the G6, America's closest allies. And I want to pick up on this point, because the last time you were on with me on Fox News Sunday, you said that no country would retaliate for the tariffs that we're going to impose. But let's take a look at, in fact, what has happened since we last talked. Canada has announced tariffs on $13 billion in U.S. goods. The European Union will impose tariffs on $3 billion in American products. I understand, sir, that the objective of the president's trade policy, with your advice, some would call it a trade war, is to get the other countries to lower their tariffs on us, but hasn't the practical effect been to get them to raise their tariffs on our products?
So one of my favorite quotes of this president happened just yesterday when he said, "We've been the piggy bank for the world, and that's got to stop." If you look at Angela Merkel's Europe, you see a continent where we run a $151 billion trade deficit in goods every year. Germany has tariffs on autos 4 times higher than our tariffs on equivalent German imports here, and they sell us 3 times as many cars as we sell them. So on the issue alone, we have allies strategically, but when it comes to these trade disputes, these allies basically are robbing us blind. The president is not going to put up with that. And in terms of this retaliation, I want to get back to the Canadian miscalculation here. The Canadians, because this speaks to your retaliation.
I don't mean to interrupt, but I do want to move on because we've got limited time.
Wow, stabbing in the back, Mercedes?
Well, I had spent a lot of time talking to Larry Kudlow this weekend, where the Trump administration, they were sitting down with these G7 participants. They had reached consensus on so much of what the communique had included, including reforms to the WTO, for example. And the mere fact that the President Trump gets on the plane on his way to Singapore, and then you had Prime Minister Trudeau double-cross us and basically start attacking the United States. At that point, the president, it was incredibly disappointing. The president then decided to not support the statement of communique. I think it was a moment of disappointment for the administration because of the mere fact that, as we know, Canada, in so many of its cases, has pushed forward unfair trade practices that basically impact particularly so many of our farmers here in the United States, our lumber market, and it really is something that's incredibly disappointing for us to see what Trudeau has done.
I understand that in terms of the double crossing and going back on something that was initially agreed upon. But Mercedes, Canada is the biggest single buyer of American goods and services in the world. So, well, I mean, everybody we speak with says the same thing. We have a surplus with Canada. Why pick a fight with Canada? I can understand the others.
Well, I want to say that Canada picked a fight with us.
Okay.
I mean, it was clearly Prime Minister Trudeau who, moments after President Trump left, decided to attack the United States. Here's the deal. What President Trump wants to do is to provide a fair, level playing field for our those of us in our market so that they're able to export goods. What we have seen time and time again is when you look at the lumber market, for example, Canada dumps lumber into the United States. They manipulate dairy prices that impact areas like Wisconsin. And so the president wants to have this discussion in terms of ensuring that we have some reform in our trade system and wants to be working with our allies to do that. And so tariffs are one of those instruments that will be used. And so in essence, I think for Prime Minister Trudeau to, after having a successful meeting, to go afterwards and double cross us, I think that's why, you know, we know that President Trump took his action.
But what about the surplus? I mean, yes, you're talking about lumber, you're talking about dairy and the outsized tariffs, but at the end of the day, the U.S. still has a surplus with Canada.
Well, there's clearly fixes that need to be made to the trading system. This goes beyond Canada. This goes into the European Union as well, that you know, for example, that their tariffs on cars coming into the United States are at 10%.
Yeah, no,
but at the end of the day, this is a overview of how we need to be fixing the trading system. With Canada, with the European Union, there are fixes that need to be made with Canada to ensure that our farmers are not impacted by what Canada is doing.
So what happens now then, Mercedes? I mean, does this war of words threaten to poison the relations altogether between Canada and the U.S.? That's what people are worried about.
Look, I think, as you know, President Trump for very long has been a coalition builder. You look at the case, for example, that he's worked with our allies to help ensure that we have a successful summit in Singapore when it comes to dealing with North Korea. President Trump has been a leader on pushing forward these changes in North Korea, has worked with Macron, has worked with Merkel. When it comes to trade, we want to see significant changes. We want to see significant reforms, and that's going to take tough talk with our allies.
Thank you, God bless you, and God bless America.